Good Wednesday afternoon. It is the final day of July, and we have a lot to talk about. Dual hurricanes out in the Pacific Basin and the Atlantic starting to show some more potential as we look out about a week from now for the potential of our third named system in the Atlantic, which would be Chantal. Starting off in the Pacific, though, we are on to our sixth named system. We have Erick and Flossie both out there coexisting as hurricanes. Erick briefly topped out in major hurricane status yesterday at a Category 4. Right now, you can see on satellite presentation, it's not looking as impressive as it did about 18 hours ago. And Flossie, much larger of a system, also having some issues of its own to try to gain some strength. First, we'll start off with Hurricane Erick, still a powerhouse, 120-mile-per-hour sustained winds with gusts up to 150. This is a 24-hour loop of the infrared satellite imagery. This tells us the temperature of the cloud tops when you see a lot of the whites, the blacks, and the pinks. That indicates very tall, very mature thunderstorm activity. Those cloud tops are very, very cold, meaning they're very high up into the sky. Certainly, you can see that surrounding that well-defined eye about 24 hours ago, but really in the last 12 hours or so, you're starting to kind of see a wobble. I like to equate this to spinning a top. When the top is completely vertical, it's pretty much centralized, right? But when it starts to wobble a little bit, it's starting to be on its downward trend of development, starting to kind of fall apart a little bit. And this is kind of foreshadowing of what's to come with Erick. It has peaked at its intensity at a Category 4. It's going to be moving into some areas that's not going to be so much conducive of it remaining together, and we can already start to see the first kind of hints of that. Here's the water vapor imagery: dry air, moist air. Dry air is the rust color. The yellow's off towards the west of the system. It's actually starting to get entrained or pulled into the center of the circulation here, so that's starting to disrupt its flow just a little bit. Some stats on Hurricane Erick, though. It's been an impressive system so far. Second major hurricane of 2019 in the Pacific Basin, right behind Hurricane Barbara a couple weeks ago, that also topped out at a Category 4 status. And this, as Barbara did, achieved rapid intensification. It went from 70-mile-per-hour sustained winds, a high-end tropical storm, to a Category 4 hurricane with 130-mile-per-hour winds in 18 hours. We've seen this happen multiple times, and it likely won't be the last either. You can see here the trend for weakening as Erick heads to the west, to the south of the Big Island of Hawaii, eventually down to a tropical storm and then remnant tropical low by the time we get to early next week. Now, it is going to bring some big surf to the Big Island. Look at some of these numbers here in terms of those wave heights, getting up to 25-foot swells coming on through there as we get towards the end of the week. There'll be some good news for the surfers in that particular part of the world. Hurricane Flossie right behind Erick, still not very organized. In fact, it has weakened some since we last talked. It's down to 75-mile-per-hour winds. Remember, you need 74 or higher to be considered a Category 1 hurricane, so just barely at that status. And it's expected not to really strengthen much, at least in the short term. It is kind of running into the same issues that Erick is, starting to pull in a little bit of some of that dry air, but we're really starting to see wind shear take its toll on this system as well. Here is the forecast track on Flossie. It is expected to weaken down to a tropical storm later today and into tomorrow, but back up to a Category 1 hurricane status as it gets a little bit closer to the Hawaiian Islands before weakening yet again by early next week. Here's a look at those sea surface temperatures. Anything that's shaded orange is those temperatures above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Why above 80? Well, you need 80 or hotter to release that latent heat which powers these tropical systems. Anything below that really won't get the job done. So these are all 80 or warmer. Notice here, we're right at that mark there of 80-degree water temperatures, but it does start to stray north of that line and encounter some cooler ocean waters. But that's not the only thing. Wind shear is going to be the big problem. You're seeing some unfavorable environments here for that wind shear coming in out of the southwest to the north and east, displacing and disrupting the flow of Flossie over really the next 24 to 36 hours with that system. Now, as we head into the Atlantic, we're entering August tomorrow, and that is the start of a very active period as we look back at all past hurricane seasons. 27% of all named storms occur in August, right behind September, which is the peak of the season, around September 10th, September 11th. About a third of all named systems occur in September, so we're really going to look for a marked increase in the Atlantic Basin, especially as we progress through the entire month of August. Right now, there are two waves we're watching out in the Atlantic Basin. One here that was formerly dubbed Invest 95L. With it kind of getting destroyed over the last couple of days, it's not even designated that anymore. Has about a 10% chance of any development as it heads towards the southeast coast of the United States, likely with just some enhanced thunderstorm activity and maybe some rough surf there, but doesn't look too promising, even though it's going to enter a window of possibly being some conducive atmospheric conditions for it to develop, but not likely. However, I'd put some bets on this one here. Out in the middle of the Atlantic, a wave that emerged off the coast of Africa several days ago. We've been watching this one for a while, and now National Hurricane Center has upped the odds to 50-50 of this becoming our next named system as we get out past 5 days. In the next 2 days, really zero chance of any development. This will likely be dubbed Invest 96L in the short term. Right now, it's going into an area, dry air, wind shear. But by 5 days in this orange shaded area here, as it gets towards the lesser and greater Antilles, we're going to start to see it enter an area where it's going to have a lot less wind shear to deal with and a little bit of an opportunity for it to develop. Here's the overall shape of the basin. Very hostile environment, lots of dry air. I'm showing you the water vapor imagery again. The yellows, the rust color is the dry air, and you can see there is lots of it. Certainly some moisture coming off the continent of Africa, those African easterly waves that'll seed the Atlantic, and eventually this will moisten up here and become a little bit more conducive. Also, pretty cool layer on here. This is the Saharan air layer, and what this is, I know it's kind of hard to see. I'm trying to find a different color table for this, but this is the dust that gets picked up in the upper levels of the atmosphere from the Saharan desert. So that's also aiding in the very dry air out in the middle of the Atlantic. Here's a closer look on the infrared satellite imagery of that wave that'll likely be Invest 96L by later today, as NHC will probably up the odds maybe to 60% on this developing in the next 5 days or so. Very broad circulation. There's no center of circulation with this. It's just a tropical wave, a big bunch of thunderstorms that are broadly rotating. Now, as this heads off to the west, it's going to eventually head into some better environments. But right now, see plenty of that dry air pretty much encircling the entire system there. But for right now, it's at least holding it off. And that other area, formerly known as Invest 95L, not much to it anymore, just a broad area of some thunderstorm activity north of Hispaniola heading into the Bahamas. Plenty of dry air and wind shear doing its number on that as well. Let's look at this, what's going to be 96L here on the forecast models. We'll start off with the European. We'll track it over the next 10 days or so. Really not much development as we head through the later parts of this week. By Friday, still quiet, not likely a named system yet. But as it approaches the greater and lesser Antilles, the Leeward Islands, by Sunday night, starting to possibly see it getting a little bit better organized, and certainly as it heads into the Bahamas and near the Puerto Rico area, starting to see that close off its low. And as it heads into early next week, or really the later part of next week, so we're looking at 7 and 9 days out from now, you see a closed off low displaced well off the coastline. A lot of the models are hinting at a breaking down of a ridge of high pressure that'll be over the Atlantic that'll allow this to curve on out to sea. Will that happen for sure? Too early to tell. A lot of things can change. There are a lot of moving parts with this that we're going to have to watch closely. Here's how the American model sees things. We have some agreement on the long-term models, which is some good news for now. Both of these paint a very similar picture as of now, with it developing in the Bahamas area, then doing that recurvature out to sea and staying well away from land. You see it about a couple hundred miles off the coast of the east coast of Florida before it loops on out to sea. This all has to do with that Bermuda High, the Azores High, the big ridge of high pressure sitting over the Atlantic. Depending on its strength and its location, 7 to 9 days out from now will determine where the system goes. So these are Cape Verde systems, or Cabo Verde Islands. This is where the waves develop off the coast of Africa, so they get that name. If this high pressure is relatively weak, we see that recurvature out to sea in the middle of the Atlantic, a fish storm, occur pretty quickly. If this high is just a little bit stronger, we see it get pushed a little bit closer to the eastern seaboard. However, if it's super strong, which we've seen plenty of times before, it could even push the system all the way into the Gulf of Mexico. So right now we're looking at a pretty good likelihood of it recurving out to sea away from any land masses, but 7 to 9 days out from now, as I mentioned, there is a lot that can change. If you have any questions, find me on social media, Facebook, meteorologist Tim Pandajis, or on Twitter, 13 Tim Pandajis.